In this part, we're going to investigate the origins and consolidation of the Nazi regime. We're going to analyse this in 3 areas. Firstly, Nazi ideology. Secondly, Nazi rise to power and the decline of the Weimar Republic, 1928 to 1933. And thirdly, methods of consolidation of power. Right, now to place Nazism in context, we need to first take a look at the background in which it developed. The Republic of Germany was declared on the 9th of November 1918, following the resignation of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Faced with the fall of Germany's allies and an extremely unstable situation at home, the new government had little choice but to sue for peace, which they did 2 days later. Now, this surprised those on the front line because despite being on the defensive, they were still on enemy soil. In May 1919, the German government had little choice but to sign the Treaty of Versailles, in which Germany lost territory, faced restrictions on her military strength, and was ordered to pay reparations. Worst of all, Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war. Article 231, originally intended to be a justification for reparations, became known as the War Guilt Clause. Problems continued for the new Weimar government. Challenges came from both left and right, and in 1923, economic collapse led to hyperinflation. Against this background, the German Workers' Party was founded in 1919 by Anton Drexler, becoming the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1920, with Adolf Hitler as its undisputed leader in 1921. This staged a failed putsch in 1923, for which Hitler spent a year in prison. It did, however, remain a fringe party until the period of the Depression, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag in 1930 and the largest in 1932. Nazi ideology. Now, you are quite likely to be asked your understanding of one or more of the meanings of terms linked to Nazi ideology. Questions like this are often at the beginning of your paper and may start with phrases such as
explain briefly, or what is meant by, or what is your understanding of.
They are usually of low marks, so you will need to show your understanding as succinctly as possible. Wasting valuable time with too much detail is a common mistake that you should try to avoid. Now, let's have a look at 3 key areas of Nazi ideology by answering the following questions.
Explain briefly the meaning of the Fuhrer Princip, the leadership principle.
In 1933, Ernst Huber, a Nazi political theorist, said,
"The Führer is the bearer of the people's will. He is independent of all groups, associations and interests. In his will, the will of the people is realised."
This really sums up what is meant by the Fuhrer Princip. It demanded unquestioning loyalty to the Führer. This obedience to Hitler gave the NSDAP unity, when in reality it was really quite divided. Through this principle, the Nazis stood for strong authoritarian government, which they believed was necessary for German recovery. Around Hitler developed the cult of the individual. Hitler was portrayed as a saviour of Germany, and he was often seen like a godlike figure. There are many reports of Hitler's charisma, and his speeches inspired many to join the NSDAP and believe that only he was able to save Germany from chaos and ruin. Explain the Nazi racial theory in the context of the Nazi state.
It will be easy to get bogged down here in the origins of Nazi racial theory. The second part of the question helps to give your answer a focus so that you can be more selective with the knowledge you give. Hitler believed the state existed to preserve the supremacy of the Aryan race. Race, he argued, formed the basis of the state, not class or other imposed boundaries. The Nazis aimed to create Volksgemeinschaft, a community of German peoples. This would be to the exclusion of those who were not of the Aryan race, in particular the Jews. Hitler claimed that a world Jewish conspiracy was working to undermine the strength and supremacy of the Aryan race. Nazism saw the state as being organized into a strict chain of command, with the Fuhrer at the top and the Jews, or Untermenschen, at the bottom. Those at the bottom existed to merely serve the Aryan race. Also of lower status were the peoples of Eastern Europe, and this was used as a justification for the policy of Lebensraum. In Mein Kampf, Hitler claimed,
"History proves that the German people owes its existence solely to its determination to fight in the East and to obtain land by military conquest."
Once in power, these ideas led to the state-legitimized persecution of the Jews and the denial of anything not seen as German. Explain briefly the anti-Marxist views of Nazism.
It's odd, isn't it? Here we are talking about the ideologies of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, emphasis on socialist German workers, and yet we're about to say that they were against Marxism and left-wing socialism. But they were National Socialists and believed in the German community, or Volksgemeinschaft above class allegiance. Marxism and left-wing socialism, they believed, would weaken the German nation, as they were based on class conflict and encouraged people to put their own needs above those of the state. As Marxism encouraged a world revolution of the workers, Hitler saw this as linked to his view of world Jewish conspiracy. We're now going to have a look at a mid-range question. They often require you to consider a range of different factors, rather than focusing on just one, like the previous question did.
Explain why the Nazis were opposed to the Weimar Republic. Think about it.
As we have just seen, the Nazis believed that a one-leader, one-party state was necessary for a strong state. In contrast, the Weimar Republic's constitution was seen as a model for democracy everywhere. A ballot slip used in the 1920 elections had 29 different parties for the voter to choose from. To the Nazis, democracy created individual choice, and this, they believed, weakened the state as it lacked a unity of purpose. The Weimar Republic had its origins in socialism and was initially led by the SPD. Some of the government's leading ministers were also Jewish. To Hitler, this combined the two groups for which he had the greatest hatred. He was convinced that the Republic was part of the conspiracy to undermine the true strength of Germany. Throughout the 1920s, and particularly in the Golden Years, the Republic became a centre for cultural experimentation and modern thinking. For example, the Bauhaus movement led artistic thinking in Europe, and Berlin's nightclubs were very popular. Women had greater freedom from their traditional role in the home. In contrast, Nazism stood for a return to traditional values. They looked back to a pre-war era where they saw a stronger Germany. They believed these modernising trends contributed to Germany's weakened state. Hitler saw himself as a crusader against moral corruption. Now, if you can, it's always good to put a bit of evaluation into your answer. When looking at a range of factors, the best way is to identify what you see as the most significant factor. Now, I believe that the most important factor in why the Nazis were so opposed to the Weimar Republic was that they sued for peace and then signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazis subscribed to the extreme right-wing view of Dolchstoss. This was the idea that the Weimar government had stabbed Germany in the back when they ended World War I, because they believed that Germany was still able to win the war and that the Treaty of Versailles had destroyed Germany. The government were often referred to as the November criminals. To show evidence of evaluation, I need to be able to justify this claim. So here goes. The strength of feeling that the end of the war created in Hitler and other nationalist groups would take a long time to heal. Here's an example of how Hitler described his reaction to hearing of Germany's surrender whilst in hospital recovering from a gas attack.
Hatred grew in me, Hatred for those responsible for this deed? What was all the pain in my eyes compared to this misery?
It provided Nazism with a very real focus against Weimar, and a belief that Germany could only be strong again if the shackles of Versailles were removed. When Stresemann followed his policy of fulfilment, this only added to the Nazi view that Weimar was working against the interests of Germany. Unfortunately for the Weimar Republic, the fact that they would always be linked to the end of the war meant that Nazism would always oppose them.
Okay, time to move on to look at the rise of Nazism and the decline of the Weimar Republic. In this section, we are going to focus on answering a question. We will be using sources 1, 2, and 3, and your own knowledge. First, let's listen to historians 1 to 3. In your exam, this will be written down.
The future for Weimar looked promising, and without the onset of the world economic crisis from 1929, it might have remained so.
At one of the early congresses, I was sitting around, surrounded by thousands of SA men, and Hitler spoke. I was most interested at the shouts and more often the muttered exclamations of the men around me, who were mainly workmen or lower middle class types. He speaks for me. He speaks for me. Ach Gott, he knows how I feel. Many of them seemed lost to the world around them and were probably unaware of what they were saying. One man in particular struck me as he leant forward with his head in his hands and with a sort of convulsive sob said, "God be thanked, he understands."
The economic crisis acted as a trigger, occasioning the abandonment of a political system that had already lost its legitimacy.
Explain the ways in which, in relation to other factors, it was the economic crisis of 1929 that enabled the rise of the Nazi regime in the period 1928 to 1933.
What a nice question. It tells you everything you need to do if you want to get good marks. Most importantly, you must refer to the sources and use your own knowledge in your answer. The question also tells you the topic and the dates, and it even reminds you to look at other factors and say whether they are more or less important. This requires an extended answer, and it will often be the question that carries the most marks, so it's important to get it right. Structure is crucial to longer answers, so it's a good idea to plan before you start. As you don't have a lot of time in an exam, you could try brainstorming, then ordering your points. It might look a bit like this. I've decided to organise my points in this way. It gives you a focus to get you started, and that's where we're starting. The economic crisis. The rest I'll tackle following numerical order, which I have decided will be like this. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash marked the beginning of depression in the USA. Unfortunately, as Weimar Germany had relied on American loans to sustain its economy through the Dawes Plan, when those loans were withdrawn, economic collapse in Germany was devastating. By 1932, 6 million were registered unemployed. Okay, so there's the facts. But where's the evaluation linking the economic depression to the rise of the Nazi regime? Economic collapse destroyed many people's confidence in the government, and some turned to the political extremes of Nazism and communism that offered to help them. Remember the instructions to use the sources. Well, here seems a good opportunity to support my point with source 1, that sees the economic crisis as the crucial factor in the collapse of the government. The question says, in relation to other factors. So that's what we need to do now. Right, another factor was propaganda. So, okay, propaganda spread the Nazi message through a variety of media, combining local and national issues. Have a look at the headlines on these 3 leaflets as an example of targeting different groups. This poster is clearly trying to appeal to the industrial workers, and the offer of work and bread appealed to many Germans in the Depression. The cult surrounding Hitler helped to draw supporters into Nazism. Despite internal divisions over ideology and a chaotic party structure, loyalty to the Fuhrer gave the appearance of a well-organized party. His speeches drew people into believing that only Hitler was able to save Germany from the chaos it was in. Here's where we can refer to a source in our answer. Look back at source 2. It suggests that Hitler had an almost hypnotic quality, speaking to their needs. Source 2 also mentioned the presence of the SA at the rally. Look at this picture. What words would you use to describe the SA? The role of the SA in helping the Nazi regime into power is also important. They provided a sense of belonging to those who joined and served as a useful propaganda tool at rallies, marches, and in the streets. Perhaps you've thought of words such as orderly, disciplined, militaristic, but maybe also intimidating. Many middle classes saw the SA as disciplined and organised, everything which they did not see in the government. The middle classes, the elite, and the industrialists were fearful of the rise in communism and saw the SA and Nazism as an effective weapon against it. The SA were proof of Hitler's claim that he would introduce firm government. In street battles between the communists and Nazis, the police often stood by and left the SA to fight. What was unseen was the role the SA played in stirring up these battles, creating the impression that a workers' revolution was closer than it really was. I think it's about time we linked back to the question. The desperation of the economic depression led people to look elsewhere for help. The Nazis seemed to offer an alternative to the government. You could therefore argue that economic depression was a key factor in allowing the Nazi message to be heard. The combination of effective propaganda, the image portrayed of the SA, and the cult of Hitler played a major role in spreading Nazism. Right, we've said that there was a rise in support at the other end of the political spectrum, the communists. If economic depression was the only factor, then why not consider the communists? Surely they had an equal chance. No. Everything we've just said about the strength of the Nazis was not true for the communists. They were not a party that could cut across class barriers. This was because they always remained a radical party. They refused to join the SPD to gain political acceptance by the less radical groups in German society, and they had no support from the USSR. Hitler was the political realist, and when he joined the DNVP in the Harzburg Front, the NSDAP became politically acceptable. It also gave the Nazis access to the national media through Hugenberg. What's more, the communists Ernst Thälmann did not possess the charismatic leadership of Hitler. And if that wasn't enough, the communists seriously misjudged Hitler. They believed that even if he did gain power, that it would be short-lived. Here comes the evaluation. It was the economic crisis that drove people to extreme politics, but it was also the failure of the communists to put up a serious challenge to the Nazis that added to their rise. In March 1930, Chancellor Müller and his coalition government resigned over the cutting of dole payments. This marked the end of democratic politics, and the chancellors that followed were unable to achieve a majority in the Reichstag and relied on President Hindenburg to rule by decree. Weaknesses that already existed in the Weimar government became exposed during the economic crisis. The system of proportional representation used by the Republic meant a large number of parties were represented in the Reichstag. Remember the ballot paper we looked at earlier? The problem was twofold. It allowed extremist parties to get a foothold into mainstream politics, and it also meant governments needed to survive on coalitions. As parties in the Reichstag continued to put their own interests above solving the national crisis, governments reached political deadlock and were unable to pass legislation which may have helped solve the depression. Chancellor Brüning therefore increasingly relied on another aspect of the Weimar Constitution, Article 48. Originally intended to protect democracy in times of emergency, Article 48 began to be used as a way of avoiding working with the Reichstag and imposing a more authoritarian style of government. Right from the start of the Weimar Republic, there were those that were never fully committed. For example, parties such as the DNVP and many government bureaucrats from the Second Reich. The problems of the Republic and the hatred of the Treaty of Versailles had led many to look to the Second Reich and a more militaristic, authoritarian style of government as preferable. Let's bring in another reference to the sources. This time, source 3 can help the evaluation of the point that the economic crisis was a trigger to expose the weaknesses already present in the Weimar Republic, opening up an opportunity into which the Nazi regime could step. However, the Nazis had to be given that opportunity. In fact, whilst the elections of September 1930 and July 1932 had been to the NSDAP's advantage, the election of November 1932 had seen a decline in the number of seats held by the Nazis. So, whilst economic crisis had created the circumstances in which the Nazis had the opportunity to rise to power, was it really responsible for Hitler's appointment as Chancellor? Remember, you could argue either way, but I'm going to say that the key factor was the misjudgments and failings of individuals in the Weimar government. Following the July 1932 election, Hindenburg refused to allow Hitler to become Chancellor. Personal rivalry between Franz von Papen and General Kurt von Schleicher ensured that by January 1933, Hindenburg felt he was left with no option. Lacking the cooperation of the Nazis in the Reichstag, Papen was forced to resign in November 1932. Schleicher's plan to weaken the Nazi position by offering them positions in government failed to divide them. Papen saw his opportunity to return to power and began negotiations with Hindenburg to bring Hitler into government under his control. Papen believed that he would be able to control Hitler in a cabinet that would be dominated by conservatives, not Nazis. To the traditional elites, industrialists, and the army, this seemed a much safer option than working with the socialists, who could threaten their existing powers. On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor by President Hindenburg, and it was from here that Hitler was able to consolidate his regime. Without the miscalculations, particularly of Papen, Hitler would not have been made Chancellor. So, here goes our conclusion. Right. Economic crisis played a key role in enabling the rise of the Nazi regime by creating the conditions in which Nazism could flourish. However, there were other factors involved. The appeal of Nazism was just as crucial as the failures of its opponents, namely the communists and Weimar. If it had not been for the miscalculations of the elite and conservative politicians, Hitler would never have been given the opportunity to take power. Preparing for a question on either the rise to power of the Nazis or the decline of the Weimar regime is relatively straightforward. You'll always need the same or similar topic areas, just with a different twist. Remember, it is the evaluation that gains you marks. For example, you might be asked to evaluate the role of the weaknesses in the Weimar Republic, or the role of Nazi ideology in relation to other factors. As part of your revision, try to draw up a spider diagram of different factors involved in the rise to power of the Nazis between 1928 and 1933. When you're in the exam, you can always change the emphasis once you know the focus of the question. We're going to look at two question types in this section: an explanation question and a response to an evaluation question. Write this down. This is more in depth than the initial questions, where you need to show your understanding of a key term, but it still doesn't require a massive response. What you are looking to do is develop your statements to demonstrate your understanding.
Thanks, Chris. Let's just remind ourselves of the question again. So to answer that, we're going to focus on intimidation and the power of the state. Intimidation had always been a weapon used by the Nazis. For example, as Hitler's personal army, the SA was extremely intimidating in their military-style uniforms and tendency towards violence. Their massive presence at the passing of the enabling law must have had an impact on the numbers of Reichstag deputies voting to accept it. The SA continued their campaign of intimidation, smashing party offices and pressing leaders of other political parties to close the party. Those are good points, and you could stop at this, but for a really good mark, your knowledge would need to be specifically applied to the question. So how about adding on to your answer? This was an important part of the consolidation process because it contained opposition through fear of violence. The SA's role in the passing of the enabling law and in the intimidation of other political parties helped the Nazis to establish a one-party state. Try to relate the following to the question. Coercion was state-organised. The decree for the protection of people and state granted the government emergency powers following the Reichstag fire. It gave them the power to carry out arrests, censor post, and search private houses, all of which acted as useful tools of coercion. These powers were granted indefinitely and stayed in effect until the fall of the Nazi regime in 1945. Let's go over to Jessica to hear more.
And we're live in 5, 4, 3.
Good evening, I'm Jessica Hall. First tonight, on the 20th of March, the first concentration camp was opened in Dachau. Removal of political opponents such as the communists and those not in line with the Nazi ideology to these camps remained a feature of Nazi Germany throughout the regime. It was not unusual to find someone had disappeared, taken to the camp for re-education. Next tonight, after the Night of the Long Knives, the main instrument of terror and coercion was the SS. This was not as overt as the SA's bullying stance had been. The SS established a network of informants, and citizens were encouraged to report any evidence of opposition. Interrogation and beatings were also common tactics used. I'm Jessica Hall. Gute Nacht. Hitler had successfully consolidated the Nazi regime by 1935. Explain whether you agree or disagree with this statement.
Lower level responses to this question would be very one-sided. They will either agree or disagree with the statement and show no opinion at all. the answer would just list the ways the Nazi regime consolidated their power. However, if you are going to demonstrate your skills at evaluation, you will need to look at both sides of the argument to arrive at a reasoned judgment. In considering this question, we're going to look at 4 key areas: removal of other political parties, centralization, control of the party, and control of the German people. In each area, we'll identify the key areas of knowledge to show how consolidation was achieved, and then follow up with an evaluation of success.
This began almost as soon as Hitler became Chancellor. Elections were scheduled for the 5th of March. In between that time, the Decree for the Protection of the German People and the Decree for the Protection of the People and State had been passed. These measures reduced the ability of parties to fight the elections. On the Reichstag's return, the enabling law was passed through a combination of party deals and threats. It gave the Chancellor legislative and executive powers for 4 years, meaning Hitler could impose authoritarian rule without consultation with other parties. It only took another 4 months before all other political parties had agreed to dissolve themselves or had been banned. On the 14th of July, 1933, the law against the establishment of parties made membership of any political party other than the NSDAP illegal. In the election of November 1933, one party, the Nazi Party, was returned to Parliament. Centralization. Following the decree for the protection of the German people, the SA and SS stirred up trouble in individual states. This was used as proof that governments couldn't cope and were replaced by Nazi-controlled governments. Nazis also replaced local police commissioners with Reich governors in all states. In January 1934, all states were made subordinate to the central government, and their rights to create laws were abolished. Central government, by the beginning of 1934, was unchallenged by the states. Many of the civil servants and the elite were sympathetic towards Nazism. Most were therefore unresisting to the regime. However, there was increasing dissatisfaction with the regime as party offices and positions took control. There is also evidence of individual officials attempting to protect people from the SS, helping them to flee the country or putting names into missing persons files. By the end of 1933, there was really only President Hindenburg who was able to challenge Hitler's powers through the Constitution. In August 1934, he died, and Hitler assumed the post of Chancellor and Fuhrer of the Reich. The army that had been under the control of the president now swore allegiance to Hitler and wore the swastika. With the backing of the army, it would be difficult for anyone to challenge the regime. In fact, many of the generals were glad to serve a government that challenged the Treaty of Versailles and gave status to the military. Remember the date in the question? If there is a date, always take note. It'll help you shape your answer and evaluation. In 1935, the army was not totally controlled by the Nazi state. Takeover was gradual and didn't really happen until the second half of the 1930s. Nazi-trained generals began to join the army. The Nazi government increasingly told the generals what to do. For example, they had resisted the invasion of the Rhineland in 1936. The High Command remained independent until 1938, when Hitler took over leadership of the army and of military strategy, following the resistance to war by the generals. Hitler also needed to ensure he was not challenged from within the party, particularly from those who supported the socialist elements of Nazism. The Night of the Long Knives in July 1934 purged the party of the SA leadership. Gregor Strasser and a number of nationalist politicians were also murdered. This had massive consequences for the consolidation of the Nazi regime. Dissension within the party and outside was curbed through fear. Hitler said in 1934, "He who lifts his hand against the state now knows that certain death is his fate." The removal of the SA, who wanted to replace the army with a people's army, meant that the army supported Hitler a month later when he took the role of Chancellor and Fuhrer. It was all very well working to ensure that Hitler was unchallenged politically, but what about the Nazification of the German people? After all, only 37% of the population had genuinely voted for them. As we saw at the beginning of this section, coercion was in the most part successful in keeping anyone thinking of challenging the regime from doing so. Those who were not supporters mostly just closed themselves off from what was happening. This is known as inner emigration, and whilst it means that not everyone was a supporter, it doesn't mean that the regime faced serious challenges. And in any case, many Germans were satisfied with the regime. By the end of 1934, unemployment had already been reduced to 2.6 million and was continuing to fall. The threat of revolution had gone and order had been restored. It was really after 1935 that total propaganda became a feature in containing opposition to the regime. For example, from December 1936, it became compulsory to attend the Hitler Youth. There was one area of life in Germany that by 1935 Hitler still had no control over: the Catholic Church. In July 1933, the Catholic Church gave up political rights to secure religious freedom. It remained in opposition throughout the 1930s, for example, defying Nazi attempts to ban the displaying of crucifixes in Catholic schools. Germans saw attendance at church as a way of expressing their opposition to Nazism, which held an anti-religious stance. Remember, a good conclusion sums up points made, refers to the question, and states the argument. Have a go at deciding whether you agree or disagree with the statement. Hitler had successfully consolidated the Nazi regime by 1935. Nearly there now. Well done for working so hard.